The setback at Horizon Airport. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the massive glass windows of Horizon International Airport, the faint hum of conversations and the shuffle of footsteps seemed to fade into the background. Elijah Carter, standing tall with his eyes locked on the check-in counter, felt a wave of exhaustion roll over him. It had been an incredibly demanding few weeks. From intense strategy meetings to critical negotiations, he had been running on little more than adrenaline. Yet, there was something else weighing heavily on his mind, his company's most recent project, which had the potential to change the landscape of the tech industry forever. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was getting to Tokyo in peace, without further interruption. The flight was supposed to be a brief respite, the chance to unwind for a few hours as he prepared for the meeting of a lifetime. He could already imagine himself reclining in the plush comfort of his business-class seat, sipping a drink, and letting his mind wander to the quiet solitude of the flight. That was the plan, anyway. But the longer Elijah stood there, staring at the attendant, the more he realized that his plans might be crumbling. He was no stranger to travel. In fact, as the CEO of one of the most successful tech firms in the world, he often found himself hopping between meetings in far-flung cities. First-class flights, private jets, and impeccable service were part of his life now. That level of comfort was not an indulgence, but a necessity to keep up with his demanding schedule. And business class was not just a luxury, it was his right. He had earned it. So when the attendant's words landed like a heavy blow, something inside him snapped. The words, "No available business class for you," reverberated in his mind as if they were a challenge, an accusation. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a deep sense of injustice in the air. Elijah wasn't sure if it was just the fatigue or something else entirely, but the entire interaction felt off. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The attendant's nervous demeanor wasn't lost on him either. It wasn't that she was intentionally rude, but there was a distinct sense that she was uncomfortable in his presence. Elijah had noticed it before, in some corporate spaces, and even in personal interactions. But he always brushed it off. It was part of the price of success, the way some people looked at him, the way they treated him as if he were somehow other. It was a subtle thing, a shift in the air when he entered a room, a glance that lingered just a little too long. Yet, here, at the airport, it felt more like a blatant disregard than an oversight. "Look," he said, his voice now lowering, more measured. "I've traveled with this airline for years. I've flown business class countless times, and I've never faced an issue like this. You need to fix this." The attendant fumbled with the computer, her fingers shaking slightly as she tried to process the booking details again. Elijah watched her, silently observing how she avoided his gaze. After another long pause, the attendant turned the screen towards him, showing a list of passengers and their assigned seating. "I'm afraid," she said hesitantly, "there's nothing I can do. There are no seats in business class for you on this flight. The flight is full." Elijah felt a tightness in his chest. Full? His mind replayed the details of his booking. He had checked everything before leaving the office. He had confirmed the reservation hours ago. There was no way that the business class seats were full, not on a flight he had booked months in advance. His pulse quickened as his thoughts began to race. Something was off. A sense of disbelief washed over him, then a steady, simmering anger. How could this be happening? Why was this happening? The attendant seemed to notice the change in his demeanor, and her voice faltered. "I can offer you an upgrade to first class, for a fee, of course," she added quickly, as though trying to appease him. "An upgrade to first class?" Elijah echoed, his voice now firm but controlled. "That's not what I paid for. I didn't book first class, I booked business class, and that's what I expect to have. I'm not looking for an upgrade. I'm looking for what I've already paid for." A few moments of silence passed between them, thick with tension. The manager, a stocky man in his 40s, appeared behind the counter and offered a forced smile. He had been standing off to the side, likely observing the growing exchange, and now he moved to intervene. His eyes flickered between Elijah and the attendant before settling on Elijah's face, where he noticed the unmistakable calm fury. "Mr. Carter," the manager greeted, his tone attempting to smooth over the situation. "I understand there seems to be some confusion here. Please, let's get this sorted out." Elijah nodded slightly, his jaw tightening. "Yes, let's get it sorted," he said, not masking the sharp edge in his voice. The manager turned to the attendant, gesturing for her to step aside. "I'll handle it from here," he said before turning back to Elijah. "Mr. Carter, if you could just give me a moment, I'll have this resolved. I apologize for the inconvenience." Elijah's mind was racing. He had been in this position before, facing unnecessary obstacles and barriers, questioning why things were never as easy for him as they seemed to be for others. But there was a new feeling now. A sense of determination that had settled within him, mingling with his frustration. He wasn't going to back down this time. Not without a fight. "I've already waited long enough," Elijah replied, his voice low but steady. "I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved." The manager shifted uneasily, then disappeared behind the scenes to speak with the gate crew, leaving Elijah standing at the counter, his thoughts churning. He wasn't one to make waves, especially in public settings like this. His reputation as a CEO, a leader, had always been built on his ability to navigate difficult situations with grace and poise. But this was different. This felt like a direct challenge, not just to his position, but to his very identity. As he waited, Elijah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a random mix-up. There's something else here. His eyes flicked over the crowd of travelers, each of them absorbed in their own routines, their own concerns. He wondered how many others, like him, had faced similar challenges but hadn't spoken up. He thought about how many people had walked away from situations like this, simply because they didn't feel they had the strength or the right to demand respect. The manager returned after what felt like an eternity, a sheepish look on his face. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid there's no business class seat available for you," the manager said once again, his voice apologetic but still carrying an air of finality. Elijah, however, was no longer just frustrated. He was resolute. He took a slow breath, meeting the manager's gaze with unwavering focus. "I'm not asking for your apology, nor am I interested in your excuses. I'm going to speak with someone who can actually resolve this." As he turned toward the gate, a sense of clarity filled him. Whatever was happening here, Elijah Carter wasn't going to walk away from this one. Not this time. A call for accountability. As Elijah made his way toward the gate, his steps grew more deliberate, his mind locked in a single, powerful thought: this was more than a booking mistake. This was a statement. He could feel it deep within him, an unspoken message that went beyond the confines of the airport terminal. His frustration was palpable, but beneath that frustration was something much more profound, the feeling that this moment, this indignity, was part of a much larger pattern. He had seen it before, the way people would act around him, the subtle shifts in tone when he entered a room, the dismissive attitudes that flared up when he questioned something. Elijah had learned to dismiss it all over the years, chalking it up to the usual discomfort some people felt around those who defied the expectations of society. But today was different. Today, he wasn't going to be silenced. Today, he wasn't going to walk away without ensuring that his voice was heard. The manager's polite apologies and stammered explanations did little to calm his nerves. Elijah had dealt with far worse in his career, from shady business deals to harsh corporate betrayals, and yet this moment, this affront to his dignity, cut deeper than any of them. What should have been a simple conversation about a seat reservation had turned into something more personal, something that felt more like an intentional slight than an honest error. He arrived at the gate counter, where a new attendant stood, her hands folded in front of her as she greeted him with a practiced, but distant smile. Elijah did not return the smile. He simply stood there for a moment, gathering his thoughts before speaking, careful not to let his emotions get the best of him. "I need to speak to someone in charge," Elijah said, his voice controlled but firm. The attendant blinked, slightly taken aback. "Sir, I'm afraid the manager just stepped out," she said, her voice faltering slightly as she glanced at the empty office behind the counter. Elijah's patience was wearing thin. "I've spoken to the manager already, and he has made it clear that he isn't able to resolve this issue. I need to speak with someone who has the authority to take action," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man who was no longer willing to accept half-hearted excuses. The attendant hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Her eyes darted around the room as if looking for backup, and Elijah could sense the unease that had begun to ripple through the air. He had seen it before, the discomfort people felt when they encountered a person who wasn't afraid to demand what they were owed. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she said, trying to soften her tone. "But if you'd like, I can help you find another flight." Elijah raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "Another flight," he repeated, his voice low. "I'm not asking for another flight. I'm asking for the seat I've already paid for. This isn't about an alternative. This is about accountability." The attendant flinched slightly at the firmness in his voice, and Elijah could see the shift in her expression. She wasn't accustomed to passengers speaking to her with such authority. It was evident in the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting nervously from him to the empty manager's office. "I will not be moved from this spot until this issue is addressed," Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. He had a reputation to maintain, yes, but more than that, he had a belief in justice and fairness that transcended everything else. If they thought they could dismiss him, they were wrong. He wasn't just any businessman, they couldn't ignore him and expect no consequences. The attendant swallowed, clearly out of her depth, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, she took a deep breath and nodded. "Please wait here, sir. I'll contact someone else who can assist." As she disappeared into the back office, Elijah stood there, seething with frustration but refusing to let it show on his face. He knew that this moment could be a turning point, not just for him, but for anyone who had been ignored or treated unfairly simply because of who they were. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about making sure no one else would face the same indignity, especially those who didn't have the platform or the resources to demand the respect they deserved. Elijah's mind began to drift, but not to the business deal waiting for him in Tokyo. His thoughts turned inward, reflecting on his journey to this point. It had been a hard climb, one that had involved countless sleepless nights, days spent fighting for recognition, and years of overcoming every obstacle thrown his way. Yet, he had always managed to rise above. He had faced prejudice, discrimination, and doubt, but each time, he fought back stronger. The world had expected him to fail, but instead, he had built a legacy that demanded respect. And now, here he was, fighting not just for a seat on a flight, but for the respect he had earned. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door to the back office swung open, and a tall, well-dressed man in his mid-40s emerged. He was the senior customer relations manager. Elijah could tell by his confident posture and the way he carried himself. He wasn't someone who looked easily flustered. "Mr. Carter," the man said with a slight nod of recognition, his voice steady. "I'm Trevor Richards. I understand there's an issue with your reservation." Elijah studied the man for a moment before responding. "There's more than an issue with my reservation," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I was assigned to economy when I clearly booked and paid for business class. I've been told there are no seats available, yet I find that hard to believe." Trevor nodded, glancing at the computer screen for a moment before meeting Elijah's eyes. "We've had a bit of a situation here," he began, his tone soothing but not entirely sincere. There was an overbooking in business class, and unfortunately, there's nothing we can do at this moment. We've been offering passengers alternatives, but I understand your frustration. Elijah's pulse quickened, but he managed to keep his expression neutral. Alternatives, he repeated. I'm not interested in alternatives. I paid for a service, and I expect that service to be honored. If there's an overbooking issue, then you need to find a solution. Trevor's smile faltered, a subtle sign of discomfort. He glanced at the attendant, who was still hovering near the back of the counter, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The unease in the air was palpable now. Elijah could sense it, feel the tension building with every word. We're doing our best to accommodate everyone, sir, Trevor said, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. But sometimes these things happen. I understand this is frustrating, but we do have procedures in place. Elijah took a step forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes never left Trevor's face, his voice cold and unyielding. I don't want your procedures. I want what I paid for. I'm not leaving here until I'm given what's rightfully mine. And I'm not going to sit quietly while you offer me excuses and alternatives. For a moment, Trevor seemed to weigh his options. It was clear that Elijah wasn't the type of man who would back down easily, no matter how many times he was told no. The silence hung heavy between them, and the airport noise seemed to fade into the background. Finally, Trevor sighed, a resigned expression crossing his face. I see that this is something you're not willing to let go. No, I'm not, Elijah replied firmly. And if you think I'm going to walk away without taking this to the next level, then you've misjudged me. Standing for what's right. The tension between Elijah and Trevor lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Trevor's well-groomed demeanor, his stiff professionalism, seemed like a thin veneer cracking under the weight of Elijah's unwavering gaze. The airport's bustle, the murmur of voices, and the sound of distant announcements now felt like an intrusive backdrop to the showdown unfolding at the counter. Elijah stood his ground, his arms crossed in front of him, his expression cold and composed. He had learned long ago that the best way to assert control in any situation was to remain calm, to let others flounder while you held steady. Trevor, despite his position, was beginning to show signs of discomfort. His shoulders were slightly hunched, a sign that Elijah's challenge was taking a toll. The senior manager, who had once exuded confidence, was now searching for an exit, something to defuse this situation before it escalated further. But Elijah wasn't backing down. He could feel the weight of his own words, the power of standing firm, and something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about business class or his flight. It was about standing up for what was right, about demanding respect, not just for himself, but for anyone who had been made to feel small, overlooked, or dismissed. Trevor cleared his throat and leaned in slightly, his voice lowered. Mr. Carter, I understand you're upset, and I get that this situation is less than ideal. But you have to understand that overbooking is a common issue, and we're doing our best to handle it. Elijah's voice didn't waver. Overbooking doesn't explain why I was reassigned to economy class without my consent. I paid for a specific service, a level of comfort, and you are now trying to downplay it as common. This isn't a common mistake, Trevor. This is a breach of trust. Trevor glanced at the attendant, who still stood by silently, her eyes wide. The manager's face flushed slightly as he quickly glanced around, no doubt trying to gauge if there was an easy way out. But Elijah wasn't giving him that luxury. He had already taken control of the conversation. It was clear now that this wasn't going to be resolved in the same way that the manager had hoped, quick words, empty promises, and a rushed apology. Elijah, Trevor said after a moment of silence, his tone now more conciliatory. Please, let's just sit down and work this out. I'll arrange for a more comfortable seat for you in economy if you like. I'll also compensate you with miles. This way, we can avoid further escalation. I'm sure we can find a solution that's reasonable for both sides. A smile, thin and humorless, tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. Compensate me with miles? You're trying to buy my silence with miles, Trevor? He shook his head, his voice rising slightly. What you don't understand is that this isn't about compensation. This is about respect. Respect for my time, respect for the service I've paid for, and respect for the fact that I've worked damn hard to be in a position where I demand that kind of respect. The words landed like a fist. The group of travelers nearby, who had been minding their own business up until this point, suddenly paused. A few heads turned in Elijah's direction as they started to realize that something much larger was unfolding. It was as if the very air in the terminal had thickened, and now, eyes were on them. Elijah could feel the gaze of the onlookers weighing on him, some sympathetic, some curious, but all paying attention. Trevor hesitated for a moment, then tried again, his voice losing its earlier confidence. Mr. Carter, I really do understand your frustration. And I'm deeply sorry for this inconvenience. But please, understand that these things happen sometimes. We don't want any disruption, especially when you're such a valued customer. I'll make sure this is documented for future reference. Elijah's mind raced, but his face remained stoic. He could feel the weight of his next move. The more he let this manager speak, the more he felt the invisible forces of his identity, his position as a black CEO, pressing down on him. Trevor's attempts to placate him, to brush this off as an ordinary inconvenience, weren't just an insult to Elijah's dignity, but to all the struggles and barriers he had faced along the way. For all of his success, the business world, with its centuries of power dynamics, still carried its own subtle racial undertones. It was a truth that lingered, often unspoken, but ever present. And today, it felt as though that truth was at the heart of the issue. Taking a deep breath, Elijah squared his shoulders and looked Trevor square in the eye. I don't think you understand, Trevor. This isn't just about being inconvenienced. It's not about whether I get a better seat or if I earn some miles. It's about me, and about people like me, being told time and time again that our expectations don't matter. That our hard work doesn't count. That we should be grateful for whatever scraps we're thrown. I'm not going to be grateful for scraps anymore. A long silence followed. Trevor seemed to be digesting Elijah's words, his face softening ever so slightly. But Elijah wasn't finished. I'm going to make sure this is addressed, Elijah continued. His tone was calm, but there was an undeniable undercurrent of resolve. I'm going to write about this, and I'll make sure others hear about it too. I'll make sure the people who have been dismissed like this, the ones who have been overlooked, have a voice. This stops here. Trevor didn't respond right away. He stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. There was no more polished script to follow, no more rehearsed lines. The game had shifted. The senior manager was no longer dealing with a passive customer who could be placated with a free upgrade or an apology. Elijah wasn't going to let this go, and Trevor had to decide whether he would try to work with Elijah or risk making things worse. The silence stretched, and just as it seemed as if the conversation would turn into a stalemate, the assistant manager appeared once again. A woman in her early 30s, with dark brown hair tied back in a neat ponytail, approached with purpose. She had the air of someone who had been trained to handle delicate matters, someone who understood the importance of de-escalation. I've heard about the situation, she said, her tone measured and professional. She turned to Trevor, acknowledging his presence but quickly addressing Elijah. Mr. Carter, my name is Karen Wright. I'm the head of customer relations for this terminal. I'd like to personally apologize for the confusion surrounding your seating. Elijah raised an eyebrow, skeptical but willing to listen. Karen, he said, his voice steady, though still laced with a quiet fury, I appreciate your apology. But apologies don't resolve the issue. I've already heard that line multiple times today, and it doesn't mean anything unless something is done about it. Karen nodded thoughtfully, her expression never wavering. I understand your frustration, Mr. Carter. I do. What I can assure you is that we are investigating this matter thoroughly. I'll personally ensure that you're compensated for the inconvenience. But more importantly, we're taking steps to address the situation so it doesn't happen again to you or anyone else. She paused for a moment before continuing, her voice carrying a tone of genuine empathy. We value all our customers, and I'd like to make sure you feel valued as well. Would you be willing to come with me to a private lounge while we resolve this? Elijah could feel his resolve start to soften just slightly. He had been ready to walk away, to escalate the matter further, but something in Karen's words resonated with him. Maybe this time, it was worth seeing if things could be handled differently. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the moment where something changed, not just for him, but for everyone else who had faced similar treatment. He met her gaze, and for the first time since the incident began, he allowed himself to relax ever so slightly. I'll go with you, Elijah said, his voice firm but his mind now open to the possibility that this battle might be one he could win on his own terms, without it needing to escalate any further. The power of words and the price of silence. Elijah followed Karen through the terminal, his pace steady but cautious. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some intrigued by the spectacle, others uncomfortable with the tension that still hung in the air. Despite the professionalism Karen exuded, Elijah wasn't ready to fully let his guard down. He had seen too many corporate leaders and executives try to smooth things over with empty promises, only to let the issue slip into oblivion when no one was watching. He had no intentions of allowing that to happen. Not today. Not after everything he had fought for to get where he was. As they walked toward the lounge, Karen attempted to make small talk, trying to ease the awkwardness that had settled in the space between them. I know this isn't ideal, Mr. Carter, but I want to assure you that we're working to correct the mistake. We take all feedback seriously, especially from our valued customers. Elijah nodded, acknowledging her attempt to connect, but he wasn't interested in pleasantries. Mistakes happen, he replied coolly. But this is about more than just a mistake. It's about the culture of complacency that's allowed issues like this to continue unchecked. You can apologize all you want, but unless actions follow, it won't matter. Words are cheap. It's the follow-through that counts. Karen paused for a moment, clearly taken aback by the intensity of his words. She had likely been trained to deal with disgruntled customers, but Elijah's words weren't about service failures, they were about systemic issues. They were about the silent, subtle discrimination that pervaded places like this airport, where the rich and powerful were often catered to, while others were brushed aside. She knew, perhaps instinctively, that Elijah wasn't someone who could be placated with vague assurances. As they approached the lounge, the security guard standing near the entrance gave a polite nod, acknowledging Karen's presence. She led Elijah inside, where the atmosphere shifted instantly. The lounge was quiet, plush with high-backed chairs and tables that promised comfort to those who could afford it. There was an air of exclusivity, a feeling of separation from the rest of the terminal. Elijah's eyes scanned the space, taking in the subtle luxuries around him. He had been in enough high-end lounges across the world to know that this was as much about perception as it was about comfort. The carefully curated aesthetic, the muted lighting, the quiet hum of background music, it was all designed to make the passengers feel important. But as Elijah settled into one of the chairs, his mind wasn't on the luxury around him. His thoughts were still with the other passengers, the ones who were navigating the chaos of the terminal, whose flights were being disrupted by the same issues he faced. He thought of the people who didn't have the power or the platform to demand answers. He thought of the ones who were dismissed, the ones who were silenced by the systems designed to keep them in their place. Karen took a seat across from him, her demeanor professional but with a hint of vulnerability in her posture. She had been the one to intervene, to offer the lounge as a safe space, but it was clear now that the weight of the situation was affecting her too. She wasn't just dealing with an upset passenger, she was dealing with a man who had seen too much injustice, a man who had experienced the very systems that made this mistake possible. "I know this isn't the resolution you were hoping for, Mr. Carter," Karen said, breaking the silence. "But please understand, we're doing everything we can to accommodate you. I've already contacted the flight operations manager, and we're working to find you a seat on the next flight. In the meantime, we'll ensure that you're well taken care of here. Anything you need, it's on the house." Elijah considered her words for a moment. The offer was reasonable, on the surface. She was trying to salvage the situation, to make it right by the standards of the airline. But in his heart, he knew that this wasn't just about getting a new flight. It wasn't about the comfortable seat in front of him or the luxury of the lounge. This was about something deeper, a moment in time when he could choose to either accept the status quo or challenge it. The question, he realized, wasn't whether he could get a seat, it was whether he would allow the airline to sweep this under the rug, just like so many others had done to him in the past. "No," Elijah replied, his voice firm. "I'm not interested in a new seat or a complimentary meal. I'm not here for your charity. I'm here because this issue needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in a way that creates lasting change, not just a quick fix." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had been ready to offer the usual corporate response, to placate him with an apology and a promise that things would be handled. But Elijah was holding a mirror up to the system, one that didn't just involve this airline, but the world at large. A world where people like him, successful black men and women, were still forced to fight for recognition in a space that was designed to make them feel inferior. She shifted in her seat, her eyes softening with a mixture of understanding and frustration. "I hear you, Mr. Carter. And I know you're upset, but you need to understand that things aren't always as simple as they seem. There are procedures and protocols in place, and it's not always easy to change them. You're not the only one affected by overbooking. We're doing everything we can." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "I don't care about your procedures or protocols. What I care about is the fact that this is a consistent problem, one that impacts people like me every day. You don't get to dismiss it as just another inconvenience for your customers. You're saying that overbooking happens, but I'm telling you that it happens because no one challenges it. No one holds the system accountable. So, when I walk away from this lounge today, it's not just going to be forgotten. It's not going to be swept under the rug. I'm going to make sure people know about it." Karen sat back, her arms crossed now as if contemplating his words more deeply. There was a long silence as the weight of his resolve hung in the air. She wasn't used to customers being so insistent, so determined to see things through. Most people, she knew, would have been content with the promise of a seat on the next flight, or the luxury of a plush lounge while they waited for their issue to be resolved. But Elijah wasn't like most people. He wasn't interested in short-term solutions. He was interested in change. "I understand," Karen said finally, her voice quieter now, more sincere. "You're right. This isn't just about the seat. It's about the bigger picture. And I'll do what I can to make sure your voice is heard. I can't promise that the system will change overnight, but I can promise that we'll start by taking your complaints seriously. I'll make sure that your feedback is taken to the right people." Elijah nodded, his body relaxing just slightly. It wasn't a complete resolution, not by a long shot. But it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to lean back in the chair, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to remind himself that he wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who understood, people who were willing to listen. And that, in itself, was a victory. The ripple effect. The airport lounge was quieter now, the tension that had once filled the air beginning to dissipate. Elijah could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones, a physical weight that had been growing steadily throughout the day. The flight was still hours away, but his mind was far from the destination. His thoughts were consumed by the conversation that had just unfolded, the heavy realization that the battle he was fighting today wasn't just about a single seat, it was about something much larger, something that extended far beyond the confines of the airport. Karen had left the lounge to continue working on Elijah's case, promising that she would personally escalate the issue to the airline's top executives. Her departure left Elijah with his thoughts, and the longer he sat there, the more he realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a simple customer service issue, it was a microcosm of the way the system worked, the way power dynamics were set in place, and the way people like him were often sidelined, dismissed, or overlooked. As he sat in the plush leather chair, staring out the large windows at the vast expanse of planes that filled the runway, Elijah felt the weight of history pressing on him. His ancestors had fought for their place in the world, struggling against systems that had been built to keep them down. And now, it seemed, he was fighting a similar fight, one where the invisible barriers of prejudice and privilege still loomed large, even in a space as seemingly mundane as an airport. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him, interrupting his thoughts. He picked it up, scanning the notification. It was from his assistant, Tanya. "Hey, Elijah, just got a call from the press office. They want to do a story on your flight issue. The CEO of the airline called for a statement, but they're also asking for an interview. They're saying it's a high-priority situation." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The press, the media, the thought of being thrust into the spotlight was both intimidating and empowering. He had always been a private person, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But now, the possibility of taking his story to the public was a different kind of challenge. This wasn't just about seeking justice for himself, it was about raising awareness for everyone who had been subjected to this kind of treatment. And if the press was reaching out, it meant that his story had the potential to make waves. He typed a quick response to Tanya, "Set it up. Let's get this out there. We're not letting this slip through the cracks." The decision was made. Elijah knew the risk, taking a stand would inevitably attract attention, both positive and negative. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became, if his voice could make a difference, if his story could inspire others to stand up for what was right, then it was worth the exposure. As he prepared for the interview, his mind began to shift focus. No longer was he just a businessman looking to board a flight. He was becoming the face of a movement, the symbol of a fight against systems that perpetuated inequality, whether through overt discrimination or the subtle, everyday slights that so often went unnoticed. He could feel the weight of that responsibility, but he also felt the strength that came with it. He wasn't alone in this fight. People like him, people who had been wronged, who had been silenced, were waiting for someone to speak out. Karen returned to the lounge shortly after Elijah made his decision. She had a more serious look on her face now, as though she understood the gravity of what was unfolding. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice steady but carrying a hint of concern, "I've spoken with our top management. They're aware of the situation, and they're taking immediate steps to address it. However, I have to warn you that this could escalate quickly. If the press gets involved, there's a lot more at stake than just a missed flight." Elijah stood up, his posture confident. "I'm aware, Karen. But this isn't just about me. This is about anyone who's had their dignity stripped away, anyone who's been told their concerns don't matter. It's about time that people with influence stand up and say, enough is enough. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Karen looked at him for a moment, her expression a mixture of admiration and caution. "I understand. And I'll do everything I can to make sure the airline takes full responsibility for this. But just know that the fallout from this could be significant." Elijah gave a small nod, his determination unwavering. "Let it be significant. Sometimes it takes a shake-up to get real change." Just then, his phone buzzed again. It was Tanya, confirming the details for the press interview. Elijah read the message, then turned to Karen. "I have to go. The press wants to hear my side of the story. I'll be in touch soon with more updates on the situation." Karen nodded, her eyes softening with a mix of respect and concern. "Good luck, Mr. Carter. You're doing the right thing. I hope the outcome is as positive as you deserve." Elijah didn't respond right away. He knew the risks. But at that moment, none of them mattered. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the principles that guided him, for the people who had come before him, and for those who would come after him. The press conference was a whirlwind. Elijah stood in front of a crowd of reporters, their cameras flashing, their microphones extended toward him. He had prepared himself mentally for the onslaught of questions, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the moment he walked into that room. The bright lights, the sea of faces, all of it felt surreal. But as he stood there, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was his moment. This was his chance to use his voice for something bigger than himself. The first question came from a reporter with a clipboard, her voice eager. "Mr. Carter, can you tell us more about the issue you encountered with the airline? What exactly happened?" Elijah took a deep breath, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "I was flying to a business meeting when I was told that I had been downgraded from business class to economy. I was given no explanation and no offer to make it right. The airline staff treated me as though my concerns didn't matter. And this is not an isolated incident. This happens to people all over the world, people whose concerns are dismissed because of the color of their skin, their background, or their social status." There was a collective murmur among the reporters, some of them nodding, others scribbling notes. Elijah continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This is about more than just a missed flight. This is about systemic inequality. It's about the ways in which people of color are consistently treated as second-class citizens. And it's about time that we, as a society, start holding these institutions accountable. We cannot afford to let this continue." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling on everyone present. Then came the next question, a bit more tentative. "Do you think the airline is doing enough to address the issue?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "Not yet. Words are easy, but actions speak louder. I'm giving the airline a chance to make things right, but I'm also going to hold them accountable if they don't. We need to see real change, not just empty promises." As the interview continued, Elijah's confidence grew. He could feel the ripple effect of his words, the impact they were having. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about creating a movement, about making sure that those who had been silenced had a voice. By the time the interview ended, Elijah knew that things had changed. Whether the airline acknowledged it or not, the world was watching now. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed, the aftermath of a stand. The weeks following the press conference were a blur for Elijah. His story had taken on a life of its own, the headlines picking up steam as news outlets from around the world followed the controversy sparked by his experience. Every day, there was a new update, statements from the airline, interviews with various executives, public apologies, and, of course, criticisms from those who felt threatened by his challenge. The media frenzy was intense, but Elijah had expected it. What he hadn't anticipated was how deeply it would resonate with so many people, especially those whose voices had never been heard. The airline, in a rare show of transparency, had issued a public apology. They acknowledged the mistake and promised to reevaluate their policies regarding overbooking, customer treatment, and diversity training. But Elijah wasn't interested in their words anymore. Their apology was hollow, a calculated response designed to quell public outrage. Actions, he knew, would speak louder than anything they could say. What truly surprised him was the flood of messages that came pouring in, emails, letters, social media posts, from people who had experienced the same thing. Stories of passengers who had been mistreated, disrespected, or outright ignored, simply because of their race or background. Elijah found himself overwhelmed by the volume of messages, each one a testament to the deep, often hidden, layers of discrimination that people faced every day. There were messages from black business leaders who had been quietly navigating the corporate world, just like him, never daring to speak up for fear of jeopardizing their careers. There were stories from everyday people, from young men and women trying to board flights for family vacations or business trips, who had been shuffled aside, their concerns dismissed by indifferent airline staff. Elijah realized, for the first time, just how many people had quietly suffered the same indignities he had, people who had been too afraid to make waves, too afraid to rock the boat, too afraid of what might happen if they spoke out. He felt both humbled and enraged. Humbled by the sheer scale of the injustice, and enraged by how normalized it had become. But as more stories came to light, Elijah began to understand the true impact of his actions. His stand wasn't just about confronting one airline's mistake. It was about igniting a conversation, about shining a light on the everyday battles that people fought in silence. The calls continued to come, but they weren't all from journalists. Elijah was now being approached by social justice organizations, legal teams, and even activist groups who wanted to support him in taking further action. They wanted to help him build a case, to bring the issue of racial inequality in customer service to the forefront. Some offered to help him launch a larger campaign, while others asked if he was ready to lead a class action lawsuit against the airline for systemic racial discrimination. But as much as Elijah appreciated their support, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what that would entail. The thought of a drawn-out legal battle, of becoming a poster child for the movement, filled him with uncertainty. He had always been a man of action, a strategist who believed in finding solutions without becoming bogged down by bureaucracy. Yet, the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that his actions had already set something in motion, a wave that couldn't be easily stopped. And if he didn't continue to push, he risked losing the momentum he had gained. A few days after the press conference, Elijah was invited to a special roundtable discussion with executives from major airlines, civil rights leaders, and industry experts. The invitation had come directly from the airline's CEO, who, after being pressured by the media, had agreed to meet with Elijah in an attempt to repair their relationship. It was clear to Elijah that the airline's leaders were trying to save face, but it also presented a unique opportunity, a chance for him to speak directly to the decision-makers and ensure that real, lasting change would come from this moment. Elijah arrived at the round table with his mind focused and clear. He had already made his decision. He wasn't going to let them get away with merely talking. He wasn't interested in superficial promises. He wanted concrete changes, a commitment from the airline to overhaul its policies, to invest in diversity training, and to address the unconscious biases that plagued their operations. The meeting room was large, with a polished conference table at its center. Around it sat representatives from various sectors of the airline, including senior executives, human resources leaders, and customer service managers. On the other side of the table, there were leaders from civil rights organizations, including some who had been working on issues of racial discrimination in the transportation industry for years. Elijah sat in the middle, his presence commanding the room, his calm but confident demeanor making it clear that he wasn't there to placate anyone. The CEO of the airline, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, opened the discussion with an apology. "Mr. Carter, we want to sincerely apologize for the unfortunate experience you had. We recognize that it was a mistake, and we are committed to ensuring that something like this never happens again. We take full responsibility." Elijah nodded, but his expression remained stern. "Your apology is a start, but let's be clear about one thing," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't about one mistake. This is about a culture of indifference and complacency. It's about the fact that so many people, people of color especially, are routinely treated as second-class citizens by companies like yours. What are you going to do about that?" The CEO seemed taken aback by the directness of Elijah's words, but he nodded slowly. "We understand that, Mr. Carter, and that's why we're here today. We've initiated a review of our policies, and we're working with experts to ensure that our staff undergoes extensive training on issues of race, bias, and customer service. Elijah leaned forward, his eyes never leaving the CEO's. That's a start, but it's not enough. You need to publicly commit to changing how you operate, not just behind closed doors. People need to know that you're serious about this. Not just your employees, but your customers. You need to create a transparent system for handling complaints, one where people can see real results, not just empty promises. The room fell silent as the weight of Elijah's words sunk in. The airline's executives were starting to understand that they couldn't just pay lip service to the issue, they had to be willing to make meaningful changes. The civil rights leaders present were nodding in agreement, and it was clear that the conversation had taken a more serious tone. "Mr. Carter, you're absolutely right," the CEO said, his voice more measured now. "We can't continue to ignore these issues. We're committed to not only improving our policies but also creating an open dialogue with the public. We'll start by addressing the issue of racial bias, but we won't stop there. We'll take a hard look at all of our practices, from hiring to training to customer interaction." Elijah wasn't ready to give them an easy out. "That's good to hear, but I'm going to hold you to it. And I won't be silent if things don't change. This is bigger than one company, it's about changing an entire industry. You need to lead by example, and that's going to require more than just words." The meeting continued for hours, with many of the civil rights leaders offering their expertise and suggestions for how the airline could begin to overhaul its practices. It was clear that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. But for the first time, Elijah felt a sense of hope that change was actually possible. The executives at the table were listening, engaging, and, most importantly, acknowledging the flaws in their systems. As the meeting came to a close, Elijah knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But in that room, surrounded by people who were finally willing to take action, Elijah realized that his stand had sparked something far greater than he had ever anticipated. The ripple effect of his decision to speak up was already making waves in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. And as he walked out of that room, Elijah Carter knew one thing for certain: change was coming. And it was coming because people like him were finally standing up and demanding it.